Mocked for living in a treehouse at 73 years old, an elderly couple refused to evacuate during the worst blizzard in state history, and what the storm revealed hidden in their walls would make the entire town regret every cruel word they ever said. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The town of Ridgewood, Montana, population 2,847, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks long, flanked by brick buildings that had weathered more than a century of harsh winters. The diner served coffee that could strip paint, and the general store still used a manual register that dinged every time someone bought milk or cigarettes. Churches outnumbered bars 3-1, and on Friday nights, the high school football field was the only place that mattered. It was the sort of town people either loved fiercely or left as soon as they turned 18. There was no in-between. But nothing in Ridgewood's 162 years of history had given folks as much to talk about as Martin and Dorothy Hayes. Not the bank robbery of 1947. Not the tornado that took the roof off the elementary school in 1983. Not even the scandal when Mayor Hutchins ran off with the church secretary in 2006. No. The Hayes couple had become the town's favorite topic of gossip, speculation, and judgment. And the talk never seemed to stop. Martin Hayes was 73 years old, lean as a rail fence, with a gray beard that reached his collarbone, and hands that still moved with the precision of the master carpenter he'd been for over 50 years. His fingers were gnarled now, knuckles swollen from decades of gripping hammers and saws, but they were still steady, still sure. He had the kind of face that looked carved from the same wood he'd spent his life working with. All sharp angles and deep lines, weathered by sun and wind and time. His eyes were blue, the pale blue of winter sky, and they held a quietness that made people uncomfortable. Martin didn't talk much, never had. He let his work speak for him. Dorothy Hayes, 71, had silver hair she kept in a long braid that hung down her back like a rope of moonlight. Her face was lined with what her mother used to call laugh lines, deep grooves around her eyes and mouth that mapped out 7 decades of smiling, crying, living. She was small, barely 5 feet 2 inches, but there was a strength in her that people sensed immediately. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned early that rushing got you nowhere. Her hands were spotted with age, but they were skilled hands, hands that could sew a quilt, bake bread, bandage a wound, or coax vegetables from stubborn soil, and her eyes, brown and warm as fresh-turned earth, held a spark of something the town couldn't quite name. Defiance, maybe, or faith, or simply the quiet knowledge that she'd already survived worse than anything Ridgewood could throw at her. And for the past 6 years, these two had lived in a treehouse. Not a child's treehouse cobbled together from scrap lumber and hope. Not some rustic cabin elevated on stilts with a deck and a grill. An actual treehouse, built into and around 3 massive Douglas fir trees on the northern edge of their 20-acre property, 30 feet off the ground, accessible only by a spiral staircase Martin had constructed from reclaimed wood and sheer stubborn determination. The structure was a marvel of engineering and artistry, though most people in town never got close enough to appreciate it. The main living space was built around the largest of the 3 firs, its trunk passing right through the center of the room like a living support column, branches spread through the walls and ceiling, incorporated into the design rather than cut away. A sleeping loft perched in the canopy above, tucked between limbs thick as a man's torso. A small kitchen area jutted out on one side, its windows facing east to catch the morning sun. A bathroom, complete with composting toilet and a shower fed by rainwater, occupied another corner. And everywhere, windows. Tall windows, round windows, windows that opened on hinges, and windows that slid on tracks. Martin had fashioned himself. The treehouse wasn't dark or cramped. It was full of light and air, and the constant whisper of wind through pine needles. But the people of Ridgewood didn't see the craftsmanship. They didn't see the beauty. They saw two old folks living like children, playing make-believe, and they talked about it endlessly. At the Silver Fork Diner, where the morning coffee crowd gathered every day by 6, Clara Bishop held court from her usual spot behind the counter. She was 68, had worked at the diner for 43 years, and considered herself the unofficial keeper of town news, which was a polite way of saying she gossiped for a living. "I'm telling you," she said one cold November morning, pouring coffee for Sheriff Tom Bradley and old Pete Garrison. "Those two are going to freeze to death up in that tree this winter. Mark my words." Sheriff Bradley, a man of 55, who'd spent 30 years trying to keep peace in a town that mostly policed itself, sighed into his cup. "They've made it through 6 winters already, Clara." "Luck," Clara said, waving her hand dismissively. "Pure, dumb luck. But you can't cheat nature forever. One of these days, we're going to get a real winter, and that's going to be the end of them. I keep saying, somebody should do something." "Do what?" Pete asked. His weathered farmer's face creased with skepticism. "They're grown adults, own their land free and clear, ain't breaking any laws. It's not natural," Clara insisted, her voice rising the way it always did when people didn't immediately agree with her. "2 people their age should be in a proper house. Or better yet, one of those assisted living places down in Billings where people can keep an eye on them. What happens when one of them falls? What happens when Dorothy needs a hip replacement or Martin has a heart attack? They're 30 feet up in the air. They got a phone," Sheriff Bradley said mildly. "And from what I hear, they're both pretty spry." But Clara wasn't listening. She'd already moved on to her next table, spreading the same concerns, the same judgment, the same conviction that she knew better than Martin and Dorothy Hayes. What was good for them? At the post office, Jerry Mullins, who'd been delivering mail to Ridgewood residents for 27 years, complained to anyone who'd listen about the Hayes route. "Takes me an extra 40 minutes every Tuesday and Friday," he grumbled, sorting packages with practiced efficiency. "Got to drive all the way out on that dirt road, park at the bottom, hike up to that spiral staircase, climb 30 feet in the air just to deliver a couple of magazines and their social security checks. And in winter? Forget it. I'm liable to break my neck on those stairs when they're icy." "Maybe they could get a post office box," someone suggested. Jerry snorted. "I mentioned that once. Dorothy just smiled at me real sweet and said, 'We wouldn't want to inconvenience you, Jerry, but we do enjoy getting our mail delivered. Like it's my pleasure to risk my life twice a week climbing into a tree.'" Even at church, where Pastor Mackenzie regularly preached about loving thy neighbor and casting not the first stone, whispers followed Martin and Dorothy when they occasionally attended Sunday services. They'd sit in the back pew, Martin in a clean flannel shirt and Dorothy in a simple dress she'd sewn herself, and people would stare. Not openly, just little glances over shoulders, eyes cutting sideways during hymns, whispered comments behind church bulletins. "Heard they're living on nothing but squirrels and tree bark," someone murmured. "I heard Dorothy's gone senile," and Martin's too proud to admit it. My daughter said they're probably growing marijuana up there. Why else would they want so much privacy? Pastor Mackenzie, a good man who genuinely tried to practice what he preached, had gently suggested during one sermon, without naming names of course, that the Lord had given humans ground to walk on for a reason, that there was wisdom in building on solid foundations, that sometimes what felt like independence was really just isolation. He'd meant well, but Martin and Dorothy had heard it, the same way they heard all the whispers, all the judgment. They'd simply held hands a little tighter in that back pew and kept their eyes on the cross at the altar. What the town didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was how Martin and Dorothy had ended up in that treehouse in the first place. The story wasn't whimsical, it wasn't eccentric, it was survival. 8 years ago, Martin and Dorothy had lived in a 3-bedroom ranch house on Elm Street, right in the heart of Ridgewood. It was a modest home, nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They'd bought it in 1976, the year after they got married, and they'd raised 3 children there. Michael, who was now a software engineer in Seattle, Jennifer, a nurse in Denver, and Thomas, their youngest, who'd joined the Marines and was stationed in Okinawa. The kids had grown up, moved away, built their own lives. That was the natural order of things, and Martin and Dorothy were proud of them. But it meant the house felt bigger, emptier, full of echoes and memories. Martin had retired from his carpentry business at 67. Not because he wanted to, but because his back had started giving out, and his hands shook sometimes after a long day of detailed work. He'd sold Hayes Carpentry to a young couple from Billings who promised to keep the name, and he'd taken his modest retirement savings and thought, for the first time in his adult life, about slowing down. But slow wasn't in Martin's nature. Within 6 months, he was restless. He fixed everything in the house that could be fixed. He built a new deck. He renovated the garage. He constructed raised garden beds for Dorothy. And then, one night over dinner, Dorothy had set down her fork and said, "What are we doing, Martin?" And then, "If you had biddy a lice, dry friends, and I won." He'd looked up from his meatloaf, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what are we doing? We're 70 years old, sitting in a house that's too big for us, in a town where people have known us so long they've stopped really seeing us. Our children are scattered across the country. We've worked our entire lives. What are we doing with the time we have left?" Martin had set down his own fork, looking at his wife across the table they'd eaten at for 40 years. "What do you want to do?" And Dorothy, this woman who'd spent her whole life being practical, responsible, sensible, had smiled in a way he hadn't seen in years. "Remember what you promised me when we were young." He'd known immediately what she meant. The summer of 1968, at the county fair in Great Falls, where he was showing a rocking chair he'd built, and she was working the cotton candy stand. They'd talked for 3 hours after her shift ended, sitting on hay bales behind the exhibition hall, watching stars appear in the Montana sky. And he'd told her about his grandfather's land, the 20 acres of forest at the base of the Beartooth Mountains, and how someday, when he'd made enough money and gained enough skill, he was going to build them a house in the trees, where they could see the whole world. She'd laughed then, cotton candy sweet and full of belief. "I'll hold you to that," she'd said. And now, 50 years later, she was. "You serious?" Martin had asked. "Dead serious," Dorothy had replied. "We're not getting any younger, Martin. If we're going to do it, it has to be now." So they'd made a plan. They sold the house on Elm Street for $83,000, less than it was worth but enough for their purposes. They moved into a small rental apartment above the hardware store while Martin began building. The 20 acres had belonged to Martin's grandfather, then his father, then him. It sat unused for decades except for occasional hunting trips. The land was wild, pristine, untouched by development. Douglas firs rose like cathedral columns. Underbrush grew thick and tangled. A creek ran through the eastern edge, cold and clear, and full of cutthroat trout. It was exactly the kind of place people said was too remote, too isolated, too impractical, which made it perfect. Martin spent 2 years building the treehouse. Not straight through his back wouldn't allow that anymore, but steadily, methodically, the way he'd built everything in his life. He studied engineering books from the library. He researched treehouse construction online at the public computer terminal. He talked to foresters about tree health and load-bearing capacity. He ordered materials, most of them reclaimed. Old barn wood, salvaged windows, recycled metal roofing. He did almost all the work himself, though occasionally one of his old carpentry crew would drive out and help with the heavy lifting. Dorothy came every day, bringing lunch in a cooler, sitting on a stump and watching him work. Sometimes she'd help, holding boards steady or passing him tools. Mostly she'd just be there, present, patient, believing. She set up a temporary camp below the trees, a tent and a camp stove, and she'd test recipes for their new life. Learning to cook on propane instead of electric. Figuring out how to preserve food without a full-size refrigerator. Adapting, the way she'd adapted to everything life had thrown at her for 70 years. The spiral staircase alone took 3 months. Martin built it around the largest Douglas fir, each step carefully measured and anchored. He tested every board, every bolt, every joint. Safety wasn't optional when you were building 30 feet in the air. The platform came next. Massive beams bolted into the living wood of the trees at points where the trunks were thick and strong. Then the frame, the walls, the roof. He installed solar panels angled to catch maximum sunlight. He ran a pipe from the creek for water, with a hand pump as backup. He put in a wood-burning stove with a chimney that cleared the canopy. He wired everything himself. Simple circuits powered by deep-cycle batteries charged by the solar array. And slowly, impossibly, a home took shape in the branches. The town watched from a distance, shaking their heads, predicting disaster. But Martin and Dorothy didn't care. They were building a dream they'd carried for 50 years. When it was finally done, when the last window was installed and the last board sanded smooth, Martin climbed the spiral staircase one evening at sunset and found Dorothy already up there, sitting on the platform with her legs dangling over the edge, looking out at the mountains painted gold and purple by the dying light. He sat beside her, both of them breathing hard from the climb, both of them feeling every one of their 70-plus years. "Well," he said, "we did it." Dorothy took his hand. "We did." They moved in the next week. They brought almost nothing from their old life. Just clothes, books, a few pieces of furniture that fit. Everything else they sold or gave away. It was liberating, that letting go, like shedding skin they'd outgrown. That first night in the treehouse, lying in the sleeping loft with branches rustling all around them and stars visible through the skylight. Martin had installed. Dorothy had whispered, "This is it, isn't it? This is what happiness feels like." And Martin, who wasn't good with words, who'd spent his life letting his hands speak for him, had simply pulled her closer and said, "Yeah, this is it." For 6 years, they'd lived that way, simply, quietly, deliberately, They woke with the sun and slept with the dark. They heated with wood, Martin cut from fallen trees on their property. They grew vegetables in a garden Dorothy tended below, climbing down every morning and back up every evening. They kept chickens in a coop Martin built at the base of the trees. They hunted deer in season, fished the creek, foraged for mushrooms and berries. They read books from the library, played cards by lamplight, talked about everything and nothing, the way only people married 5 decades can. And they were happy, genuinely, deeply happy, in a way they'd never quite managed in that 3-bedroom ranch on Elm Street. But the town didn't see happiness. They saw foolishness. Saw 2 old people playing at being young. Saw an accident waiting to happen. It was the 2nd week of December when the forecasts started coming in, urgent and insistent. A massive winter storm was building in the Arctic, pushing south with a fury meteorologists hadn't seen in 30 years. The National Weather Service issued blizzard warnings from the Canadian border to Colorado. Temperatures were expected to plummet to -30 degrees. Wind chills to -50. Snowfall predictions ranged from 3 to 5 feet, with drifts that could bury vehicles, collapse roofs, snap power lines like thread. This is a historic weather event, the meteorologist said on the television at the general store, where a crowd had gathered to watch. His face was grave, his tone urgent. We're talking about life-threatening conditions. Anyone in remote or vulnerable areas needs to take this seriously. Seek shelter. Stock up on supplies. Do not travel once the storm hits. This is not a storm to underestimate. Ridgewood began preparing immediately. The grocery store sold out of bread, milk, and batteries within hours. The hardware store ran low on generators and propane tanks. The county opened emergency shelters at the community center and the high school. People stocked firewood, checked furnaces, sealed windows with plastic sheeting. The plows were readied. The salt trucks were loaded. And emergency services went on high alert. And naturally, everyone thought of Martin and Dorothy Hayes. Because if anyone in Ridgewood was vulnerable, it was 2 elderly people living 30 feet up in a tree. Sheriff Tom Bradley drove out to their property on a gray Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before the storm was expected to hit. His cruiser bounced along the rutted dirt road that wound through the forest, branches scraping the sides, mud churning under his tires. When he reached the clearing where the treehouse stood, he parked and stepped out into the cold wind that was already picking up, already carrying the promise of what was coming. He tilted his head back, looking up at the structure that never failed to impress him despite his concerns. The treehouse rose from the forest floor like something from a fairy tale. Wooden platforms and walls nestled among massive fir branches, smoke rising from the chimney pipe, windows glowing with warm yellow light in the afternoon gloom. "Martin! Dorothy!" he called, his voice carrying up into the canopy. A moment later, Dorothy appeared on the main platform, wrapped in a thick wool coat Martin had bought her 10 Christmases ago, her silver braids swinging as she leaned over the railing. "Tom, what brings you out here? Storm's coming," he said, hands on his hips, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. "Big one. Biggest we've seen in decades, maybe ever. You 2 need to come into town. We're setting up shelters at the community center and the high school gym, cots, hot meals, medical personnel on standby. It's going to be bad, Dorothy. Really bad." Dorothy smiled. And it was the kind of patient smile teachers give children who don't quite understand yet. "We appreciate the concern, Tom. We truly do. But we're staying put, Dorothy. This isn't a regular winter storm. They're predicting -30 temperatures. Wind chills that'll freeze exposed skin in minutes. Snow measured in feet, not inches. You're 30 feet up in the air in a wooden structure. What if a branch breaks? What if... The wind, Tom. Martin's voice came from behind Dorothy as he appeared beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. He was wearing his usual flannel shirt and work pants, looking as calm as if they were discussing Sunday dinner plans. We've been through this before. Maybe not quite this bad, but we've weathered storms. We've got everything we need. Food stores, water, firewood stacked 10 cords deep. The structure is sound. The trees are healthy. We'll be fine. Sheriff Bradley stood there in the cold, looking up at them, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. They were his people, his town. If something happened to them, if they died up there because he didn't try hard enough to convince them to leave, how would he live with that? But he also knew Martin and Dorothy Hayes, knew their stubbornness, their self-reliance, their absolute conviction that they'd chosen the right path. And he knew, deep in his gut, that nothing he said would change their minds. "You've got a phone up there?" he asked, defeat creeping into his voice. "We do," Martin confirmed. "Landline or cell, both. Landline's more reliable, but we keep the cell charged just in case." Bradley pulled a card from his pocket and held it up. "This is my direct number. Not dispatch. Me. You call if anything goes wrong. Anything at all. Tree branch falls, stove goes out, you start feeling too cold, whatever. You call me, and I'll figure out how to get to you. Understand?" Number 4. Number 4. Number 4. Dorothy's expression softened. "We understand, Tom. And we're grateful. But truly, we'll be fine." The sheriff stood there a moment longer, memorizing their faces, just in case this was the last time he saw them alive. Then he nodded, climbed back into his cruiser, and drove away, the weight in his chest not lightening even slightly. By that evening, word had spread through Ridgewood like wildfire spreading through dry timber. The Hayes couple was refusing to evacuate. They were staying in their treehouse during what might be the worst blizzard in Montana history. And people were not kind about it. "They've finally lost their minds completely," someone said at the bar. "Natural selection at work." Another person laughed darkly at the grocery store, loading up their cart with canned goods. "When they find those 2 frozen solid come spring, don't say we didn't warn them," Clara Bishop said to everyone, and no one at the diner, her voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction that comes from being proven right, even if the cost is human life. At the hardware store, Pete Garrison shook his head while buying extra propane tanks. Stubborn as mules, both of them, always have been. "Stubbornness ain't enough when it's 50 below, and the snow's up to your neck," his companion replied. Even people who generally liked Martin and Dorothy, who'd appreciated their quiet kindness over the years, couldn't help but think they were making a terrible mistake. Couldn't help but imagine the worst. Couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread about what would be found when the storm finally passed. But Martin and Dorothy didn't hear the talk. They were too busy preparing. The afternoon Sheriff Bradley left. Martin spent hours outside, chopping wood, splitting logs with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained for 60 years, his breath coming in clouds, sweat dampening his flannel shirt despite the cold. He stacked the wood in neat rows under the platforms, protected from snow by the treehouse structure above. 10 cords, he'd told the sheriff, but in truth It was closer to 12. He'd been preparing since October. Knowing this winter felt different somehow, felt heavier. Dorothy worked inside, checking their stores. Shelves lined one wall of the main room, and they were packed with jars of preserves she'd put up during summer and fall. Pickled vegetables, canned venison, jams and jellies, dried beans, rice, flour, sugar, salt. She had a mental inventory of everything, knew exactly how long they could last if they had to, months if necessary. She filled every container they owned with water, lining them up along the kitchen counter. The creek wouldn't freeze completely. Martin had assured her of that, but better to have extra on hand. She checked their medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, the prescriptions they both took for blood pressure and cholesterol. Everything was stocked, organized, ready. They cooked together that evening, a massive pot of venison stew thick with potatoes, carrots, and onions from the garden. Dorothy baked 3 loaves of bread, filling the treehouse with the smell of yeast and warmth. They'd need the calories in the coming days, need the sustenance. They ate dinner at their small table, the one Martin had built from a single piece of oak, looking out the west-facing windows at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and deep, foreboding gray. "Think we should have gone to town?" Dorothy asked quietly, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. Martin looked at her, really looked at her, the way he'd been looking at her for 50-plus years. He saw the strength in her still, the determination, but also the flicker of doubt, the natural human fear of the unknown. "Do you want to?" he asked gently. She thought about it, weighing it the way she weighed all important decisions, with care and honesty. Then she shook her head, her braids swaying with the movement. "No. This is our home, Martin. We built it together. We've lived here 6 years. If something's going to happen, I'd rather it happen here, where we belong, than in some shelter surrounded by people who think we're foolish." He reached across the table and took her hand, his rough carpenter's fingers entwining with her smaller, equally work-worn ones. "Then we stay, together, whatever comes." She squeezed his hand. "Whatever comes." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, washed the dishes together in the small sink, fed by their rainwater system, and then sat by the wood stove, reading by lamplight. Martin was working through a thick book about the Lewis and Clark expedition, fascinated by the details of their journey through this very region. Dorothy was knitting, her hands moving with the automatic precision of decades of practice, creating a scarf in deep blue wool. The stove crackled and popped, radiating warmth that filled the space. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the trees creak and sway gently. A sound they'd grown so accustomed to it was like silence. Around 9, they climbed up to the sleeping loft, moving carefully in the semi-darkness. They'd left the main lamp burning low below, just enough to see by. The loft was their sanctuary, the most private space in the treehouse, tucked up among the branches with a skylight above where they could see stars on clear nights. The bed was simple, a double mattress on a platform Martin had built, covered in quilts Dorothy had sewn over the years. They changed into their nightclothes, the routine of 50 years of marriage, and climbed under the covers. Through the skylight, they could see the sky had clouded over completely, gray and heavy and oppressive. No stars tonight, just the promise of what was coming. "Storm'll be here by morning," Martin said quietly, his arm around Dorothy's shoulders as she rested her head on his chest. "We'll be ready," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. They lay there for a while, listening to the wind increase, feeling the gentle sway of the treehouse. A motion that had frightened them the first few nights they'd lived here, but now felt as natural as breathing. The trees were strong. Martin had told her 1,000 times. 300 years old, some of them. They'd weathered worse than any blizzard. They'd bend but not break, and the treehouse would bend with them. Eventually, they slept, holding each other the way they'd held each other through every storm of their lives, literal and metaphorical. And when they woke before dawn to a roaring sound like a freight train bearing down on them, when they woke to violence and chaos, and wind that screamed through the forest with murderous intent, they faced it together, the way they'd faced everything for the past 5 decades. The storm had arrived, and Martin and Dorothy Hayes, stubborn, foolish, forgotten by a town that had already written them off, were about to prove that sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones who survive. The sound woke them before dawn, not the gentle whisper of wind through branches they'd grown accustomed to, but a roar, deep and primal, like something alive and furious, bearing down on them with murderous intent. Martin's eyes snapped open in the darkness of the sleeping loft, his heart already hammering. Beside him, Dorothy stirred, her hand instinctively reaching for his. "It's here," she whispered, though the words were barely audible over the shrieking wind. Martin sat up slowly, feeling the treehouse sway in a way it never had before. Not the gentle rock of a cradle, but something more violent, more insistent. The entire structure groaned, wood protesting against forces it had never been designed to withstand. He reached for the flashlight they kept beside the bed, clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating their small sanctuary. Everything looked normal. The quilts, the small shelf of books, the photographs of their children and grandchildren tacked to the wall. But the sound, the terrible roaring sound, made normal feel like a memory from another life. "We need to get downstairs," Martin said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, away from the skylight. They dressed quickly, pulling on layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirts, wool sweaters, thick socks. Every movement was careful, deliberate, fighting against the sway of the treehouse and the adrenaline that wanted them to panic. Dorothy's hands shook slightly as she braided her hair, muscle memory taking over even as her mind raced. Martin helped her down the ladder to the main level, his body positioned to catch her if she fell, then followed close behind. The main room of the treehouse was in chaos, not from anything they'd done, but from the storm itself. Wind found every crack, every gap, howling through spaces Martin thought he'd sealed. The windows rattled in their frames like something was trying to break through. Outside, visibility was zero, just white, endless, swirling white that pressed against the glass like a living thing. The temperature had already dropped. Martin could see his breath forming clouds in the beam of the flashlight. He moved to the wood stove immediately, feeding it logs from the stack beside it, coaxing the embers back to life. Heat was survival. Without heat, they'd be dead by nightfall. The stove caught, flames licking up around the new wood, and warmth began radiating outward in waves. Dorothy was already at the kitchen area, filling a pot with water from their stored containers, setting it on the propane burner to make coffee. Not because they needed coffee, but because the ritual of it, the normalcy of it, helped keep the fear at bay. "How bad do you think it is?" she asked, her voice steadier than Martin expected. He moved to one of the windows, wiping condensation from the glass, squinting out into the maelstrom. The wind was easily 70 miles per hour, maybe more. Snow fell so thick it looked solid. A wall of white that obliterated everything. The trees around them bent at angles that seemed impossible, their trunks bowing like dancers, branches whipping and crashing against each other. Several smaller trees had already snapped, their broken tops visible as dark shapes in the chaos, before being swallowed by the white again. "Bad," Martin said honestly. "But we're okay. The main trees are holding." The structures sound. As if to mock his words, a massive crack echoed through the forest, loud enough to be heard over the wind. They both froze, listening. Another crack, then a tremendous crash as something heavy hit the ground below them. A tree, a big one by the sound of it, but not one of theirs. Martin checked the support trees, the 3 massive Douglas firs that held the treehouse. They were bending, swaying more than he'd ever seen. But they were alive, flexible, strong. "We're okay," he repeated, more to convince himself than Dorothy. They spent that first day in a strange limbo between terror and tedium. The storm raged outside with unrelenting fury, but inside, they were warm, fed, safe. Dorothy made oatmeal for breakfast, adding dried berries and honey, and they ate at their small table, not talking much, just being present with each other. Martin checked the structure every hour, walking the perimeter of the main room, listening for stress in the wood, watching for cracks or separation in the joints. Everything held. His carpentry work, 2 years of careful planning and execution, was being tested in ways he'd never imagined, and so far, it was passing. By noon, the temperature inside had stabilized around 55 degrees, cool but manageable with layers. The stove worked tirelessly, Martin feeding it every few hours. They read, conserving the batteries in the flashlights, using what little daylight filtered through the white chaos outside. Dorothy worked on her knitting, the rhythm of it soothing, meditative. Martin sharpened tools he'd been meaning to sharpen for months, his hands needing something to do, needing the familiar motion of whetstone against steel. In town, Ridgewood was dying. The storm hit Main Street like a hammer, winds funneling between the brick buildings, snow piling up in drifts that reached second-story windows within hours. Power lines snapped, plunging the entire town into darkness. The county plows tried to keep the roads clear, but gave up by mid-morning, the operators barely able to see their own hoods. The emergency shelters at the community center and high school filled quickly with people who'd lost heat, lost power, or simply didn't trust their homes to withstand what was happening outside. Sheriff Bradley spent the day coordinating emergency response from the community center, which had backup generators keeping lights on and heat running. People came in scared, shaking, talking about the apocalypse, the end times. The temperature outside had dropped to -28, with wind chills approaching -50. Anyone caught outside for more than a few minutes would die. That wasn't hyperbole. That was simple biological fact, and every few hours, someone would ask about the Hayes couple. "You think they're still alive up there?" Clara Bishop asked, wrapped in 3 blankets, her usual sharp tone softened by fear. Nobody could survive this in a treehouse. Bradley didn't answer. He just kept working, kept organizing, kept trying not to think about Martin and Dorothy 30 feet up in the trees, exposed to the full fury of the storm. He'd tried calling their landline twice. No answer. Cell phone went straight to voicemail. The lines were probably down, or they were already dead. He pushed the thought away and focused on the people he could help, the people right in front of him. By the second day, the storm had somehow intensified. Meteorologists on emergency radio broadcasts called it unprecedented. A once-in-a-century event, possibly once in 500 years. The entire state was buried. Highways closed. Airports shut down. Montana was isolated. And within Montana, towns like Ridgewood were isolated from each other. Islands of humanity, separated by impassable seas of snow and ice and wind. In the treehouse, Martin and Dorothy had fallen into a survival routine. Wake with first light, such as it was. Feed the stove. Eat breakfast, usually oatmeal or the bread Dorothy had baked. Toasted over the stove. Check the structure. Read or work on small projects. Eat lunch. Venison stew reheated from the pot they kept constantly warm. Check the structure again. Afternoon reading or quiet conversation. Dinner. More stew or beans and rice. Evening by the stove. Martin, reading aloud now, because Dorothy's eyes were tired. Check the structure one final time. Bed in the sleeping loft, holding each other against the cold and the fear and the sound of the wind that never, ever stopped. They didn't talk about what would happen if something went wrong. Didn't discuss worst-case scenarios. They just survived, hour by hour, task by task. Dorothy found herself thinking about their children. Michael in Seattle, probably watching news coverage and terrified. Jennifer in Denver, trying to call and getting nothing but deadlines. Thomas in Okinawa, too far away to help even if he knew what was happening. She hoped they weren't too worried. Hoped they trusted that their parents had survived worse. But she knew they probably were worried, probably frantic. And there was nothing she could do about it from 30 feet up in a tree in the middle of a historic blizzard. Martin's mind worked differently. He thought about the structure constantly, running calculations he'd done 2 years ago, remembering every joint, every beam, every decision. Had he used enough lag bolts? Were the anchors deep enough in the heartwood? Had he accounted for wind load from this direction? The trees themselves worried him less than his own work. The Douglas firs were 300 years old, had weathered countless storms, but his treehouse was only 6 years old, barely tested. If it failed, if something he'd built gave way, Dorothy would die because of his hubris, his dream, his insistence that they could live this way. The weight of that responsibility sat on his chest like a stone. It was the third night, just after midnight, when everything changed. Martin woke to a sound different from the wind, different from the constant groan of wood and crash of branches. This was a sharp crack, immediate and close, followed by a tremendous jolt that threw him against the side of the sleeping loft. Dorothy screamed, a short, shocked sound, and Martin's arms went around her instinctively, pulling her close as the entire treehouse lurched sideways. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Martin was certain they were going to die, certain the structure was giving way, that they'd fall 30 feet to the snow-covered ground below, and that would be the end. But then the treehouse settled, shuddering but holding, and the moment passed. They lay in the darkness, hearts pounding, breathing hard, listening to a new sound. A groaning, creaking sound coming from somewhere in the main room below. Martin grabbed the flashlight with shaking hands and climbed down the ladder. Dorothy right behind him, despite his whispered protests that she should stay up. The beam of light swept across the main room, and his breath caught. A section of the south wall, the one facing into the storm, had split. Not the exterior wall, thank God, but the interior paneling. A crack ran from floor to ceiling, about 4 inches wide at its widest point. The wood bowed inward from some impact they hadn't seen or heard over the wind. "What hit us?" Dorothy asked, standing beside him in her nightgown and wool cardigan, her braid hanging over her shoulder. "Branch, maybe," Martin said, moving closer to examine the damage. "A big one. But the structure held. The exterior wall is fine. This is just the paneling." He ran his hands along the crack, assessing the damage, and his fingers found something unexpected. A gap behind the paneling, a hollow space where there shouldn't be one. His brow furrowed. He'd built these walls himself, knew every inch of them. There was no hollow space in the design. He pulled gently at the broken paneling, and a section came away in his hand, revealing a cavity about 2 feet deep, running from floor to ceiling, hidden between the interior paneling and the exterior wall. And inside the cavity were bundles, dozens of them, wrapped in oilcloth that had yellowed with age, tied with string that had gone brittle, stacked carefully like someone had meant to retrieve them someday. "Martin," Dorothy breathed, her hand on his shoulder. "What is that?" He reached in carefully, his carpenter's hands gentle despite their trembling, and pulled out the first bundle. It was about the size of a shoebox, surprisingly heavy, wrapped so tightly the oilcloth crackled when he moved it. He carried it to the table and set it down in the circle of lamplight Dorothy had already lit. For a moment, they just stared at it. This object that had been hidden in their wall for God knew how long, revealed by a storm that was trying to kill them. "Should we open it?" Dorothy asked. Martin nodded slowly. "I think we have to." He untied the brittle string, and it broke in his fingers, disintegrating after decades of waiting. The oilcloth was harder, sealed at the edges, with some kind of wax that had gone hard and dark. He used his pocket knife to cut through it, peeling back the layers carefully, and inside was a leather-bound journal. Old. The leather was cracked and dry, the color faded to brown-gray. Martin opened it with the same care he might use handling a newborn, and the pages inside were yellowed, brittle, covered in neat, precise handwriting done in faded black ink. The first page bore a date, March 15th, 1897, and beneath it, a name, Samuel Hayes. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. "Your great-grandfather," Martin nodded, unable to speak, his eyes already scanning the page. Samuel Hayes had homesteaded this land in the late 1800s. Martin knew that, from family stories. His great-grandfather had been a surveyor, worked for the railroad, eventually settled here, and built a cabin. He died in 1934, and the land had passed through the family, largely unused, too remote for farming, too far from town for development. But Martin had never known much beyond those bare facts. His father had never talked about Samuel much, and by the time Martin was old enough to ask questions, everyone who'd known Samuel personally was dead. Now, holding his great-grandfather's journal, Martin felt like he was holding a ghost. He turned the pages carefully, reading snippets, entries about surveying work, notes about the land, the forest, the wildlife, observations written with the precision of someone trained in scientific method, sketches of plants and animals, drawn with surprising skill. This wasn't just a personal journal. This was field research. "There's more," Dorothy said quietly, looking at the broken wall. "Look how many bundles there are." Martin followed her gaze. In the cavity, barely visible in the lamplight, were at least 20 more bundles, maybe 30. A lifetime of work, hidden in a wall that hadn't existed until 2 years ago, when Martin built this treehouse, which meant he hid these somewhere else first, Martin said slowly. The pieces coming together, somewhere on this property. And when I was excavating for the platform supports, I must have found his hiding place without knowing it. These must have been buried at the base of one of these trees. Dorothy wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the nearby stove. Why would he hide them? Why not just keep them in his cabin? Martin shook his head, still reading, turning pages. I don't know yet, but we're going to find out. They spent the rest of that night going through the journals, carefully, reverently. The storm continued to rage outside, but they barely noticed anymore. They were too absorbed in the words of a man dead nearly a century. A man whose blood ran in Martin's veins, whose land they now lived on. Samuel Hayes's entries were meticulous, detailed, the work of a trained observer. He documented everything: weather patterns, animal populations, plant species, geological formations, page after page of careful notation, as if he was building a comprehensive record of the land and everything on it. But as they read deeper, moving from the first journal to the second, to the third, the entries began to change. Samuel started writing about discoveries, artifacts found on the property, arrowheads, pottery shards, what he called evidence of substantial indigenous habitation. He sketched the items, noted their locations on hand-drawn maps, theorized about their age and significance. Then came entries about caves on the eastern edge of the property, hidden behind rock formations. Caves that contained pictographs, ceremonial objects, items Samuel described as culturally priceless and extremely fragile. He was documenting indigenous history, Dorothy whispered, reading over Martin's shoulder. He found archaeological sites. Martin nodded, his mind racing. If Samuel had found significant sites, why hadn't he reported them? Why hide the documentation? He kept reading, and the answer came in an entry dated June 20th, 1928. The timber companies are expanding their operations, Samuel had written in his neat hand. They're moving south and west, and it's only a matter of time before they reach this region. If they discover what lies on this land, what treasures exist here both in terms of natural resources and historical significance, they will not hesitate to exploit it all. The company men care nothing for preservation, only profit. I've seen what they do. They will clear-cut this entire forest, disturb the sacred sites, destroy evidence of cultures that existed here long before we arrived. I cannot let that happen. The entries continued, growing more urgent. Samuel wrote about attempting to contact universities, museums, anyone who might help protect the sites. But he was a single voice, an old surveyor living on remote land, with no credentials and no influence. No one took him seriously. Or worse, when they did express interest, they wanted to exploit the sites themselves, remove artifacts for display, turn sacred ground into tourist attractions. Samuel was horrified. His final entries in that journal, dated autumn of 1932, laid out his decision. I will hide everything. All my documentation, all my maps, all my research. I will seal the artifacts in the caves as best I can and tell no one of their location. And I will hide my life's work where it cannot be found until a time when people might understand its value, might choose preservation over profit. Perhaps my children or grandchildren will find it. Perhaps no one will. But I would rather this knowledge disappear than see it used to destroy what I've spent my life trying to protect. Martin set down the journal, his hands shaking. Beside him, Dorothy had tears running down her cheeks. Outside, the blizzard continued to scream, but inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, they sat with the weight of revelation. He was trying to protect the land, Martin said quietly. Our land. He knew it was important, knew it contained things worth saving, and he hid everything to keep it safe. Dorothy reached for another bundle from the pile they'd pulled from the wall. This one was larger, heavier. She unwrapped it carefully, and inside were maps. Beautiful, detailed maps drawn by hand, showing the 20 acres in sections. Landmarks were marked. The creek, distinctive rock formations, clusters of old-growth trees. And on the maps were notations. Site A, burial ground, approximately 20 artifacts visible on surface. Site B, cave system, 3 connected chambers, pictographs in excellent condition. Site C, ceremonial circle, stones arranged in pattern suggesting astronomical significance. There were at least a dozen marked sites scattered across the property. Martin stared at the maps, trying to reconcile them with the land he knew, the land he'd walked for 6 years. He'd never noticed any of this. But then, he'd never been looking. He'd been focused on building the treehouse, on creating their home. He'd walked the same paths, seen the same trees, never thinking to look deeper, to look for what lay hidden beneath the surface. There's more, Dorothy said, her voice strange. She held up another bundle, this one containing photographs, old glass plate negatives, carefully preserved. She held one up to the lamplight, and the image reversed in her vision. A cave entrance partially hidden by vines, the opening dark and mysterious. Another showed pottery arranged on a flat rock, each piece intact, decorated with intricate geometric patterns. Another showed a stone circle in a clearing, the stones worn but still standing, clearly placed with purpose and precision. He photographed everything, Martin breathed. He created a complete record. They worked through the night, the storm forgotten, carefully documenting what they'd found. By dawn, when pale grey light finally filtered through the windows and the wind had lessened just slightly, they'd gone through 15 bundles. Each contained journals, maps, photographs, or carefully preserved specimens, pressed flowers, rock samples, small arrowheads wrapped in cloth, all meticulously labeled, dated, catalogued. Samuel Hayes hadn't just been protecting the land. He'd been conducting the most comprehensive survey of the region anyone had ever attempted, and then he'd hidden it all to keep it safe. The final journal they opened that morning contained Samuel's last entries, written in 1933, his handwriting shakier now, less precise. He was dying, Martin realized. The entries spoke of illness, of weakness, of time running out. And in one of the last entries, dated November 2nd, 1933, Samuel had written directly to whoever might find his work. To whoever reads this, whether you are my child, my grandchild, or a stranger who came after, I have made a discovery that could change everything we know about this region's history. The artifacts I've found, the sites I've documented, the evidence I've gathered, all points to something extraordinary. This land was home to thriving cultures for thousands of years before European settlement. The biodiversity here, the ecological complexity, rivals anything I've studied. But I fear, if word gets out before the world is ready, this land will be destroyed by those who seek to profit from it. So I've hidden everything here, in a place only someone who truly knows these trees would find. If you're reading this, then you understand this land in a way few people do. You've made it your home, as I did. Use this knowledge wisely. This land is sacred. Guard it with your life, as I tried to do with mine. Martin finished reading and looked at Dorothy. Her face illuminated by the morning light, her eyes red from tears and exhaustion. He was waiting for someone like us, Martin said, his voice rough. Someone who loved the land enough to live in the trees, to make this place home in a way that honored it rather than exploited it. Dorothy took his hand. What do we do? What happens next will turn this quiet forest upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful secrets. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Martin stood slowly, his back stiff from sitting hunched over journals all night, and walked to the window. The storm was easing, not ending, but lessening. The wind had dropped from a roar to a howl, and he could see farther than 5 feet now. Maybe 10 or 15 feet of visibility. The trees around them bent but standing, snow piled in drifts that reached halfway up the trunks. They'd survived. The treehouse had held, and now they held something far more valuable than shelter. They held history. We need to verify it, he said finally. When this storm ends, when we can safely get around the property, we need to check if the sites Samuel documented are still there. We need to see if 90 years has destroyed them, or if they're still intact. Dorothy nodded, rising to join him at the window. And then we get help. Real help. Experts who can tell us what we've found and how to protect it properly. Over the next 2 days, as the storm finally began to break, as the wind died down and the snow stopped falling, and the sky gradually shifted from gray to pale blue, Martin and Dorothy continued working through Samuel's collection. They found more journals, more maps, more photographs. They found detailed species lists, plants Samuel had identified, some of which he noted were extremely rare even in his time. Animal populations he'd tracked across seasons and years. Weather data spanning 3 decades, meticulously recorded, the kind of climate data modern scientists would consider invaluable. And they found evidence of Samuel's attempts to get help. Letters he'd written to universities, to museums, to government agencies. Most had never been answered. The few responses that existed were dismissive or exploitative. One letter from a museum curator offered to purchase any artifacts of value, provided they meet our quality standards. Another from a timber company representative thanked Samuel for the information about potentially valuable resources on your land and offered to discuss development opportunities at your convenience. Samuel had been alone in his efforts. One man trying to protect 20 acres against an entire world that saw the land only in terms of what could be taken from it. No wonder he'd given up trying to work within the system. No wonder he'd chosen to hide everything and hope for a future that might be kinder, wiser, more willing to preserve than to profit. On the 5th day after the storm began, Sheriff Bradley finally made it out to the Hayes property. The county plows had worked around the clock to clear main roads, and now they were starting on the rural routes. Bradley followed the plow to the turnoff for the Hayes land, then continued on snowshoes, the trees so heavy with snow they looked like something from a Christmas card, beautiful and deadly. He expected the worst. Expected to find the treehouse collapsed. to find 2 bodies frozen in the wreckage. Expected to have to call their children and tell them their parents had died because they were too stubborn to evacuate. What he found instead was smoke rising from the treehouse chimney. And when he called out, his voice echoing through the silent forest, Martin Hayes appeared on the platform, alive, waving him up. The sheriff climbed the spiral staircase, now cleared of snow, marveling that it was still intact, and emerged onto the platform breathing hard from the exertion and the altitude. Martin grabbed his arm, steadying him, and pulled him inside where it was warm. "Tom," Martin said, gripping the sheriff's shoulders, "we survived, and we found something. Something you need to see." An hour later, Sheriff Bradley sat at the small table, surrounded by journals and maps and photographs, his coffee forgotten and cold beside him, his face pale. "This is real?" he asked for the 3rd time. "All of this is real, every word," Dorothy confirmed. She'd made sandwiches, unable to help feeding people even in the middle of a crisis. Samuel Hayes, Martin's great-grandfather, documented everything: archaeological sites, indigenous artifacts, rare species, geological formations. It's all here. Bradley picked up one of the maps, studying the marked locations. "And you think these sites are still there? Still intact?" "We don't know," Martin admitted. "We haven't been able to check yet with all this snow. But if even half of what Samuel documented is still there, if the caves are still accessible and the artifacts still preserved, this could be huge," Bradley finished. "This could be huge." He set down the map and looked at them seriously. "You two understand what you're sitting on? This isn't just historically interesting. If there are intact indigenous sites on your property, with artifacts still in place, with documentation from the turn of the century proving their existence and significance, you're talking about one of the most important archaeological finds in Montana history. Maybe in the entire Northwest." Dorothy's hand found Martin's under the table. "We need to know what to do. 7 times divide," she said quietly. "Who to contact, how to handle this properly." Samuel tried to do it alone and failed. "We can't make the same mistakes." Sheriff Bradley pulled out his phone, stared at it, then laughed. "Still no service. But when we get back to town, there's someone I know. Someone who'll understand the significance of this and know how to protect it." He looked at Martin. "You ever heard of Dr. Eleanor Vance?" Martin shook his head. "Should I have? She's a professor at the University of Montana. Environmental history, indigenous studies, archaeological preservation. If anyone in this state can help you navigate this, it's her. And she's got the credentials and the connections to make sure this is handled right." They spent another hour going through the collection, Bradley asking questions, Martin and Dorothy answering as best they could. By the time the sheriff left, promising to contact Dr. Vance as soon as communications were fully restored, promising to keep this quiet until they had a plan, Martin and Dorothy were exhausted. They'd barely slept in 5 days, running on adrenaline and coffee, and the sheer, overwhelming nature of what they'd discovered. That night, they finally allowed themselves to rest. The storm had passed. The treehouse had survived. They had survived, and hidden in their walls for nearly a century, waiting through endless Montana winters, through seasons and decades and the slow turn of time, Samuel Hayes's lifework had been protected by the very trees he'd tried to save, by the land itself, and now by 2 people who understood, perhaps for the first time, why they'd been drawn to this place, why they'd built their home in the trees. why they'd refused to leave, even when everyone said they should. They weren't just living here. They were guardians. They'd been chosen, in a way, by the land itself, by Samuel's faith that someday, someone would come along who would see the value in preservation, who would choose protecting over possessing. And now, as they lay in their sleeping loft, holding each other in the darkness, listening to the silence that follows a storm, they understood their lives had just changed in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The treasure hidden in their walls wasn't gold or jewels. It was knowledge. It was history. It was proof that this land, this forgotten corner of Montana that everyone drove past without a second thought, was sacred, and that knowledge, that truth, was worth more than anything money could buy. They didn't know yet about the $230 million valuation, didn't know about the preserve that would be established, or the recognition that would come, or the way their story would spread across the country. They just knew they'd found something important, something Samuel Hayes had spent his life protecting. And now, it was their turn to protect it, their turn to finish what he'd started, their turn to prove that sometimes the people everyone mocks, everyone underestimates, everyone writes off as foolish, are the ones carrying the most valuable secrets. And sometimes surviving a storm isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Dr. Eleanor Vance arrived in Ridgewood on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the blizzard had finally released its grip on Montana. She drove a university van loaded with equipment, accompanied by 2 graduate students who looked simultaneously excited and skeptical. The roads were still treacherous, piled high with snow on either side, but the main routes had been cleared enough for careful travel. Sheriff Bradley met them at the diner, where Clara Bishop nearly dropped her coffee pot when she saw the University of Montana logo on the van's side. "What's all this about?" Clara asked, eyes wide, already calculating how quickly she could spread whatever news she was about to learn. "Official business," Bradley said, guiding Dr. Vance and her students to a corner booth, away from prying ears. But in a town like Ridgewood, there was no such thing as privacy. By the time they'd finished their coffee and headed out to the Hayes property, half the town knew something big was happening. Dr. Vance was 62 years old. With wild gray hair she kept pulled back in a ponytail that never quite stayed contained, wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down her nose, and the kind of energy that made people half her age struggle to keep up. She'd spent 4 decades studying environmental history, indigenous cultures, and archaeological preservation across Montana. She'd published 7 books, consulted on dozens of preservation projects, and had a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and absolutely intolerant of anything that wasn't backed by solid evidence. When Sheriff Bradley had called her cell phone the day after he'd visited Martin and Dorothy, describing what they'd found, her first response had been skeptical. "Tom, I get calls like this all the time," she'd said, her voice crackling over the poor connection. "Someone finds an old journal in their attic, thinks they've discovered the next King Tut's tomb. 99 times out of 100, it's wishful thinking or outright fraud. This is different," Bradley had insisted. "I've known Martin Hayes for 20 years. He's not a fraud. And Eleanor, I've seen the documentation. Journals dating back to 1897. Maps. Photographs on glass plates. This is extensive, professional quality research." There'd been a long pause. Then Vance had said, "I'll come look, but I'm not promising anything." Now, following Sheriff Bradley's cruiser along the winding forest road to the Hayes property, Dr. Vance found herself cautiously optimistic, despite her usual skepticism. The fact that these documents had supposedly been hidden for nearly a century was intriguing. The fact that they'd been found by an elderly couple living in a treehouse was unusual enough to be interesting. And the fact that Tom Bradley, a man she'd worked with on several preservation cases over the years and trusted implicitly, thought this was worth her time, meant she needed to take it seriously. When they reached the clearing and she saw the treehouse for the first time, she stopped dead, her mouth falling open slightly. "They actually live up there?" She asked, staring up at the structure nestled in the massive Douglas firs. 6 years now, Bradley confirmed. One of her graduate students, a young man named Marcus, whistled low. "That's actually incredible. The engineering alone. We're not here to study the house," Dr. Vance said, but her tone was gentler than her words. She was impressed despite herself. Martin appeared on the platform above, waving them up. "Welcome. Watch your step on the stairs." Still some ice in the shadowed spots. The climb was harder than Dr. Vance expected. By the time she reached the platform, she was breathing heavily, her legs burning. But when Martin ushered her inside and she felt the warmth from the wood stove, when she saw the carefully maintained space, the books on shelves, the quilts and photographs, and evidence of a life lived with intention and care, her respect for these people increased exponentially. Dorothy had made coffee and set out cookies she'd baked that morning. "Thank you for coming," she said simply, gesturing to the small table where they'd laid out a selection of Samuel's journals and maps. "We know this must seem strange, but we wanted experts to see this before we did anything else." Dr. Vance sat down, pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves she'd brought specifically for handling old documents, and reached for the first journal. She opened it carefully, scanning the first page. The date, the name, the handwriting. Her expression, which had been professionally neutral, shifted. Her eyes widened slightly. She turned pages, reading entries, examining the paper quality, the ink, the binding. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence except for the soft rustle of pages. Then 10 minutes. 15. Finally she looked up, her face pale. "Where did you find these?" Martin explained about the storm, about the wall splitting, about the hidden cavity filled with bundles. Dr. Vance listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her mind clearly racing. When Martin finished, she sat back in her chair and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. "Do you know who Samuel Hayes was?" she asked quietly. Martin and Dorothy exchanged glances. "My great-grandfather," Martin said. "He homesteaded this land, worked as a surveyor, died in the 30s. That's all I really knew until we found these." Dr. Vance shook her head slowly, something like awe creeping into her voice. "Samuel Hayes was one of the most respected field researchers of his generation. He published extensively in the 1890s and early 1900s papers on indigenous cultures, on ecology, on geological formations. His work was cited by major universities. Then, in 1933, he just disappeared from the academic record. No more publications, no more correspondence with colleagues. The prevailing theory was that he'd died or suffered some kind of breakdown. She gestured to the journals on the table, but he didn't disappear. He went underground. He continued his research but stopped sharing it. The question is, why? "We think we know," Dorothy said softly, and she pulled out the journals where Samuel had written about the timber companies, about his failed attempts to get help, about his decision to hide everything. Dr. Vance read those entries with increasing excitement. her hands trembling slightly as she turned pages. "My God," she whispered. He was trying to protect the sites. He knew their value, knew they'd be destroyed if word got out. So he sealed everything away. She looked up at Martin and Dorothy with something approaching reverence. "Do you understand what this means? If his documentation is accurate, if the sites he described still exist, this could be one of the most significant finds in Northwestern archaeology in decades." "Could be," her graduate student, a young woman named Lisa, interjected carefully. "We need to verify everything. Old documents can be inaccurate. Sites can be destroyed by time or nature. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves." Dr. Vance nodded, though her excitement was barely contained. "Lisa's right. We need to approach this methodically. First, we authenticate the documents themselves. Date the paper, analyze the ink, verify the handwriting against Samuel's known published works. Then we need to see if the sites he documented are still accessible." "How long will that take?" Martin asked. "The authentication?" "A few weeks for preliminary results, longer for comprehensive analysis. But the site verification, that we can start today." They spent the rest of that afternoon going through Samuel's maps, comparing them to modern topographical surveys of the property. Dr. Vance had brought GPS equipment, and markers plotted the coordinates of Samuel's marked sites. The technology was nearly a century more advanced than anything Samuel had access to, but his maps were so precise they matched up almost perfectly with current satellite imagery. "Site A," Dr. Vance read from Samuel's notation. "Burial ground. Approximately 20 artifacts visible on surface, located near the large granite outcropping 300 yards northeast of main cabin site." She looked at Martin. "Is there a granite outcropping in that area?" Martin nodded slowly. "There is. Big one, maybe 15 feet tall. I've walked past it dozens of times but never really examined it closely." "Can we reach it today?" Dr. Vance asked, already standing, her academic caution overwhelmed by the thrill of potential discovery. The snow was still deep, but they managed, all 6 of them, Martin and Dorothy, Dr. Vance and her students, and Sheriff Bradley, who'd insisted on coming along. They wore snowshoes, carried supplies, moved slowly through the winter forest. It took nearly an hour to cover the 300 yards Samuel had noted, the terrain rough, and the snow making everything harder. But when they finally reached the granite outcropping, when they stood at its base, and Dr. Vance pulled out Samuel's photograph of the site taken in 1927, the similarity was unmistakable. Same rock formation, same angle, same trees in the background, older now, thicker, but definitely the same species in the same positions. "Start clearing snow," Dr. Vance ordered, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Carefully, very carefully, they worked with small shovels and brushes, clearing away the 5 feet of snow that had accumulated over weeks of winter. Underneath was frozen ground, and beneath that, as they carefully excavated a small area, the earth itself. Dr. Vance worked with the precision of a surgeon, her students following her lead, while Martin, Dorothy, and Sheriff Bradley watched, barely breathing. And then Dr. Vance's brush caught on something. She froze, cleared more soil, more carefully now, her hands shaking. The edge of something appeared, curved, decorated with geometric patterns. She cleared around it, revealing more, and suddenly they could all see it clearly. Pottery. A piece of pottery, broken but intact enough to identify, partially buried in the earth where it had lain undisturbed for centuries. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered. "It's real. It's actually real. My." My, 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 my. Dr. Vance sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face behind her glasses. "Don't touch it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't disturb anything else. We need to document this properly. Get the right permits. Notify the tribal nations. This site is protected by federal law." She looked at Martin and Dorothy, who stood holding hands in the snow, their faces reflecting wonder and something like fear. "You've found something extraordinary. Something that's been waiting here, protected by this forest, for longer than any of us can imagine." Over the next 3 weeks, as winter slowly released its grip and the snow began to melt, the Hayes property became the focus of intense academic interest. Dr. Vance returned, with a full team of archaeologists, ecologists, and historians. They set up a base camp in a large tent below the treehouse, brought in portable heaters and equipment, and began the painstaking work of verification. The documents were authenticated first. Paper dating confirmed the journals were indeed from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Ink analysis matched formulations used during that period. Handwriting experts compared the journal entries to Samuel Hayes's known signature on official documents and his published papers, and confirmed a match. The photographs on glass plates were examined and dated, showing no signs of modern manipulation or forgery. Every technical test came back, confirming what Dr. Vance already believed. These documents were genuine. Then came the site verifications. Using Samuel's maps and notes, the research team located and documented 12 separate sites across the 20-acre property. Some were surface sites, areas where artifacts were visible or barely buried. Others were more complex. The cave system Samuel had written about so extensively was found exactly where his maps indicated, hidden behind a rock formation on the eastern edge of the property. When Dr. Vance and her team entered the caves for the first time, with proper lighting and equipment, what they found took their breath away. 3 connected chambers, just as Samuel had documented. The walls covered in pictographs, images of animals, humans, celestial symbols painted in mineral pigments that had survived centuries in the cool, dry environment. On rock shelves and in carefully arranged groupings, ceramic vessels, stone tools, decorative objects, everything untouched, exactly as Samuel had described in his journals from 1929. The team spent hours in those caves, photographing, measuring, documenting, their voices hushed with reverence. Dr. James Whitehorse, an archaeologist from the Crow Nation, who joined the team at Dr. Vance's request, stood in the main chamber with tears streaming down his face. "My people knew stories of sacred caves in this region," he said quietly, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "Places where our ancestors stored the most important objects of our culture, places that connected us to the spirit world. We thought they were lost, destroyed by development or looting, but Samuel Hayes found them, and he protected them." He turned to Martin and Dorothy, who'd been allowed to enter the caves as the property owners. "Your great-grandfather could have taken these items, sold them, made money from them. People did that all the time back then. But he didn't. He sealed this place up and kept it secret. He honored what he found." His voice broke. "Thank you. Thank you for finding his records. Thank you for protecting this. One fauna. One fauna. One fauna." The ecological findings were equally significant. Samuel's detailed species lists led researchers to discover populations of plants thought extinct for over a century, still growing in hidden pockets of the Hayes property. a type of glacier lily that hadn't been documented in Montana since the 1920s. A rare subspecies of Trillium, fungi species, that existed nowhere else in the state. Dr. Patricia Chen, the lead ecologist, spent days on her hands and knees, photographing plants, collecting samples for genetic analysis, comparing what she found to Samuel's century-old pressed specimens that had been preserved in his bundles. This property is a biodiversity hotspot, she explained to Martin and Dorothy one evening as they sat around the camp stove below the treehouse. Samuel documented 347 plant species here. We've verified 283 so far, including 17 that are critically endangered. This land has been protected from logging, from development, from agricultural use for over a century. It's essentially a time capsule of what Montana's forests looked like before European settlement transformed the landscape. The news began to leak out despite the team's attempts at discretion. A professor at the university mentioned it to a colleague. One of the graduate students posted something vague on social media. A reporter from the Billings Gazette started asking questions. And once the first story broke, once the headline, "Century-Old Archaeological Discovery on Private Land Near Ridgewood," hit the regional news, the floodgates opened. Within days, camera crews were trying to find the Hayes property. Reporters called Sheriff Bradley's office constantly. The university's public relations department was overwhelmed with interview requests. And in Ridgewood itself, the reaction was complex and, for many residents, deeply uncomfortable. At the Silver Fork Diner, Clara Bishop read the newspaper article with her mouth hanging open. "The Hayes couple," she said to the breakfast crowd, her voice shrill with disbelief. "The ones living in the treehouse. They found this?" She read aloud. "Documents and artifacts valued preliminarily at over $50 million, with potential historical and cultural value far exceeding monetary estimation." The diner went silent. People who'd mocked Martin and Dorothy for 6 years suddenly found themselves unable to meet each other's eyes. Pete Garrison set down his coffee cup carefully. "50 million, he repeated quietly. "And we called them crazy." "We called them worse than that," someone else said, shame thick in their voice. Pastor Mackenzie, sitting in his usual booth, felt his stomach turn. He thought about his sermon, about suggesting that living on the ground was somehow more righteous than living in trees. He thought about all the times he'd heard people gossip about the Hayes couple and said nothing, did nothing to defend them. He pushed away his half-eaten breakfast. Appetite gone. The shift in town attitude didn't happen overnight, but it happened. People who'd crossed the street to avoid talking to Martin and Dorothy suddenly wanted to be their friends. People who'd called them foolish suddenly claimed they'd always known there was something special about that property. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on, and Martin and Dorothy saw it clearly. But they didn't confront it. They didn't throw the judgment back in people's faces. They just kept living their lives, cooperating with the research team, answering questions, staying humble. "We didn't do anything special," Dorothy told one reporter who managed to hike out to the property for an interview. "We just found something that was already here. Something Samuel Hayes protected. We're just trying to honor what he started." But behind the discovery, behind the excitement and the validation and the media attention, legal complexities were piling up like snow in a drift. The artifacts on the property technically belonged to indigenous nations under federal law. The land itself was private property, but the sites on it were protected by the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The state of Montana had interests. The federal government had interests. The University of Montana wanted to establish a research station. Conservation groups wanted to ensure the ecological sites were preserved. And through it all, Martin and Dorothy sat in their treehouse, overwhelmed by the complexity of what they'd stumbled into. "We just wanted to know what we'd found," Martin said to Dr. Vance one evening as they sat on the platform watching the sun set over the mountains. "We wanted to do the right thing. Now I feel like we need a team of lawyers just to understand what we're allowed to do with our own property." Dr. Vance sighed. She'd been fielding calls and emails for weeks, trying to help navigate the legal maze while also overseeing the research. "I know it's overwhelming. But Martin, what you and Dorothy have done here, choosing to reach out to experts rather than trying to profit from this privately, choosing transparency over exploitation, has made all the difference. There are people who would have sold artifacts on the black market, who would have destroyed sites through careless excavation. You didn't do that. We wouldn't have known how," Martin said honestly. "Exactly," Dr. Vance replied. "You knew your limitations. You asked for help. That's wisdom, not weakness." A meeting was arranged at the county courthouse, a neutral location where all interested parties could gather. Martin and Dorothy drove into town on a crisp March morning, the treehouse visible behind them through the trees, and found the courthouse parking lot full. Inside, the main meeting room was packed. Representatives from the Crow Nation and Blackfeet Nation sat at the front. State historical preservation officials occupied one side. Federal representatives from the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service sat on the other. University officials, conservation group leaders, lawyers for various interests. And in the middle of it all, Martin and Dorothy Hayes, two elderly people in simple clothes, holding hands like anchors for each other. The meeting lasted 6 hours. Legal jargon flew over Martin's head, but he listened carefully, asking questions when he didn't understand, refusing to agree to anything until it was explained in plain language. Dorothy took notes in her careful handwriting, making sure they'd remember what was discussed. The complexity was staggering. Ownership versus stewardship. Private property rights versus cultural heritage protection. Economic value versus historical significance. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had demands. And in the center of it all, Martin and Dorothy just kept asking the same question. What would Samuel Hayes want? What would honor his intentions? It was Dr. Whitehorse who finally cut through the noise. He stood, his presence commanding immediate silence, and spoke directly to Martin and Dorothy. "You've been offered money to sell the land. You've been offered contracts that would make you rich while allowing development. You've been offered fame and recognition, but I want to know what you want. This is your land, your inheritance, your home. What do you want to happen here?" The room waited. Martin looked at Dorothy, and she nodded slightly. He stood, feeling every one of his 73 years, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. "We want the artifacts returned to the people they belong to," he said simply. "We want the sites protected so they can never be damaged or destroyed. We want the land preserved for future generations to study and learn from. And we want to stay in our home." His voice gained strength. "We're not leaving our treehouse. We've lived here 6 years. We'll die here. But everything else, all the sites, all the artifacts, all the research Samuel did, that should belong to everyone, not just us." Dorothy stood beside him. "We don't want money," she added. "We want legacy. We want Samuel's work to matter, to mean something beyond dollar signs. We want this land to teach people what he tried to teach, that some things are worth more than profit, that preservation matters, that respecting what came before us matters. The room was absolutely silent. Then slowly, James Whitehorse began to clap. Others joined him. Within moments, everyone in that courthouse room was on their feet, applauding two people who'd just turned down wealth most of them couldn't imagine, who'd chosen principle over profit, legacy over luxury. But as Martin and Dorothy drove home that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, they weren't thinking about applause or recognition. They were thinking about Samuel Hayes, about a man who died nearly a century ago believing he'd failed, believing his work would disappear into obscurity. They were thinking about how he'd hidden everything out of desperation, how he'd spent his final years isolated and defeated, and they were thinking about how wrong he'd been. His work hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right storm to reveal it. "Do you think he's watching?" Dorothy asked quietly, as Martin parked the truck at the base of the spiral staircase. "Do you think he knows what we found? What's happening because of it?" Martin looked up at the treehouse, at the smoke rising from their chimney, at the home they'd built in the trees Samuel had protected. "I don't know about watching," he said slowly. "But I think he knew, even when he was hiding everything, even when he thought he'd failed. I think some part of him knew that the land itself would protect his work, until someone who loved it as much as he did came along." He squeezed Dorothy's hand. "I think he was waiting for us, and I think we were always meant to find it." They climbed the spiral staircase together, their legs tired from the long day, their hearts full of something too complex to name. Above them, the treehouse waited, warm and welcoming. And all around them, protected by the trees that had sheltered Samuel's secrets for 90 years, the land itself seemed to exhale, satisfied that finally, after decades of patience, the right people had found what needed to be found. The people everyone had mocked, everyone had judged, everyone had written off as foolish were turning out to be exactly what Samuel Hayes had hoped for. Guardians who understood that some treasures can't be measured in money, only in the courage it takes to protect them. The official appraisal came on a warm afternoon in late April, when the snow had finally melted from all but the highest peaks, and the forest around the Hayes property had exploded into green life. Wildflowers carpeted the ground between trees. Birds sang in branches overhead. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, its sound a constant backdrop to everything. Dr. Eleanor Vance climbed the spiral staircase to the treehouse, accompanied by representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, the National Park Service, and a team of independent appraisers who'd spent 3 months analyzing every aspect of what had been found on the Hayes property. Martin and Dorothy had made coffee and set out chairs on the platform, creating a makeshift conference space 30 feet above the forest floor. The setting was surreal, discussing matters of enormous financial and historical significance, while chickadees flitted through branches and wind rustled through new leaves. But somehow, it felt right. This conversation needed to happen here, in the place where it had all begun, in the home Martin and Dorothy had built from dreams and determination. Dr. Vance opened her leather portfolio, her hands uncharacteristically shaky. In 3 decades of archaeological work, she'd never been part of something this significant. "Martin, Dorothy," she began, her voice formal but warm, "I want to start by saying what you've shared with the world, what you've allowed us to study, and document, represents one of the most important historical discoveries in the northwestern United States in over 50 years. She pulled out a bound report, easily 200 pages thick. We've completed our comprehensive assessment. The Samuel Hayes collection, the journals, maps, photographs, and specimens, has been valued by archivists and historians at $4.2 million. That's just the documents themselves, not what they represent. Martin's eyebrows rose. $4 million for old journals and maps seemed impossible. But Dr. Vance wasn't finished. The archaeological sites on your property, she continued, represent an unprecedented window into indigenous cultures spanning over 3,000 years. The cave system alone contains over 500 artifacts in remarkable preservation. Based on comparable sites and the cultural significance, the archaeological value is estimated at $35 million. Dorothy's hand found Martin's, squeezing tight. The numbers were becoming incomprehensible. The ecological significance, Dr. Vance went on, has been assessed by leading environmental scientists. Your property contains 17 plant species thought extinct or critically endangered, provides crucial habitat for threatened wildlife, and represents one of the last intact old-growth forest ecosystems in this region of Montana. The environmental value for conservation purposes is estimated at $65 million. She paused, looking at them seriously. But those numbers, as staggering as they are, don't capture the full picture. What you have here isn't just artifacts or rare plants. It's a complete, documented, preserved snapshot of this region's natural and cultural history spanning over a century. The research potential alone, the educational value, the opportunity to study climate change through Samuel's weather data, to understand indigenous cultures through undisturbed sites, to preserve biodiversity that exists nowhere else, that value is incalculable. One of the Smithsonian representatives, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, leaned forward. When we factor in all elements, the historical documentation, the archaeological sites, the ecological preservation value, the research potential, and the cultural significance to indigenous nations, our conservative estimate of the total value of what exists on your property is $230 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Martin and Dorothy sat frozen, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had gone white. $230 million. The number was so large, it didn't feel real. It felt like something from a movie, from someone else's life. That's... Martin's voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat and start again. That's more money than exists in this entire town. Maybe this entire county. It's more money than most people see in 100 lifetimes. Dr. Vance agreed quietly. And, legally, as the property owners, you have options about what to do with it. Over the next hour, they laid out those options. Martin and Dorothy could sell the land to the highest bidder, though any buyer would face severe legal restrictions on what they could do with protected archaeological sites. They could negotiate a deal with the state or federal government for purchase at assessed value. They could establish a private foundation and control access to the sites. They could partner with universities for long-term research agreements that would provide income. They could donate everything and take massive tax write-offs. The possibilities spiraled outward, each more complex than the last, each representing different degrees of profit, control, and responsibility. When the representatives finally left, promising to return in a week for Martin and Dorothy's decision, the elderly couple sat alone on their platform, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Neither spoke for a long time. They just sat, holding hands, watching the light change, listening to the forest around them. The forest that had been Samuel Hayes's sanctuary. The forest that had become theirs. The forest that, they now knew, held treasures beyond anything they'd imagined. "What are we going to do?" Dorothy finally whispered. Martin was quiet for another moment, then said, "Tell me what you're thinking. Really thinking. Not what you think I want to hear." Dorothy took a breath. "I'm thinking about our children. Michael working so hard in Seattle, still paying off student loans at 45. Jennifer, who wants to go back to school but can't afford it. Thomas, who'll retire from the Marines in a few years with no real savings. We could change their lives, Martin. Set them up. Make sure they never worry about money again. We could." Martin agreed. "I'm thinking about this town," Dorothy continued. "Ridgewood is dying. The lumber mill closed. Young people leave as soon as they graduate. If we sold even a portion of this, we could invest in the community, create jobs, revitalize the economy. We could do that too," Martin said. Dorothy turned to look at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "But I'm also thinking about Samuel, about how he gave up everything to protect this land, about how he died believing he'd failed, believing his work didn't matter. And I'm thinking about what he wrote in that last journal entry. Use this knowledge wisely. This land is sacred. Guard it with your life." Martin nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about the same thing, about what we'd be saying to the world if we took the money, that everything has a price. That preservation only matters until someone offers enough cash. That the land, the history, the cultures that existed here for thousands of years, that it's all just a commodity to be bought and sold. But $230 million. Martin," Dorothy's voice broke. "That's security. That's comfort. That's never worrying about medical bills or whether the truck will start or if we can afford to visit our grandchildren." "I know," Martin said gently. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you happy? Right now, in this moment, in this life we've built? Are you happy?" Dorothy looked around at the treehouse, at the platform where they'd shared thousands of meals, at the windows that framed the forest they'd come to know intimately, at the spiral staircase Martin had built with his own hands, at the mountains visible in the distance turning purple with sunset. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm happier than I've ever been." "So am I," Martin said. "We're not rich, but we have everything we need. We have each other. We have this place. We have purpose. What would money add to that, except complications?" Dorothy was crying now, tears running down her lined face. "You're saying we should give it all away. I'm saying we should do what Samuel couldn't. Finish what he started. Make sure this land is protected forever. Not just hidden, but officially preserved, so no one can ever destroy it. Make sure the artifacts go back to the people they belong to. Make sure the research continues. Make sure Samuel's legacy, and now our legacy, is about something bigger than money." Dorothy leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat that way, as darkness fell, and stars began appearing overhead, as they'd sat so many evenings before, two people who'd been mocked and judged and written off, making a decision that would change everything. 1 week later, they returned to the courthouse with their answer. The room was even more crowded this time, word having spread that the Hayes couple would announce their decision. News cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled the extra chairs. Martin and Dorothy walked to the front slowly, both wearing their best clothes, Martin in a shirt Dorothy had ironed that morning. Dorothy in a simple dress she'd sewn herself years ago. They looked small and old and humble. And they were about to shock everyone. Martin cleared his throat, unfolded a piece of paper where Dorothy had helped him write his thoughts, and began to read. His voice was quiet at first, then grew stronger as he went on. Dorothy and I aren't educated people. We didn't go to college. I was a carpenter. She was a homemaker who did whatever jobs needed doing. We've worked our whole lives, raised our children, and tried to live with integrity. When we found Samuel Hayes's hidden collection, we didn't understand the significance at first. We just knew we'd found something important that had been protected for a long time, and we needed to make sure it stayed protected. He looked up from his paper, making eye contact with people around the room. We've been offered a lot of money, more money than exists in most people's imaginations. And we're grateful for the appraisals, for the work everyone has done to understand what we found. But Dorothy and I have talked, and we've prayed, and we've thought about what Samuel Hayes would want, what the land deserves, and what kind of legacy we want to leave. He paused, taking Dorothy's hand. We're donating the land and everything on it. All 20 acres, all the artifacts, all the sites, all the documentation. We want it established as a protected preserve, managed jointly by the National Park Service, the University of Montana, and representatives from the Crow and Blackfeet nations. We want the artifacts repatriated to the indigenous communities they belong to. We want the ecological sites preserved for scientific research. We want the Samuel Hayes collection made available to scholars and students. And we want this place to teach people what Samuel tried to teach almost a century ago, that some things are worth more than their price tag. The room erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in shocked murmurs. In disbelief, someone shouted, "You're giving away $230 million. Martin nodded calmly. We're giving away something more valuable than money. We're preserving history. But we have two conditions," Dorothy said, standing beside her husband, her voice clear and firm. First, the preserve must be named the Samuel Hayes Memorial Nature and Heritage Preserve, so his name and his work are never forgotten. Second, we're keeping the Treehouse. We're staying here. This is our home, and we're not leaving. We'll serve as caretakers of the preserve for as long as we're able. This time, the applause came. It started with Dr. James Whitehorse, who stood with tears streaming down his face, clapping slowly, deliberately. Others joined. The representatives from the Crow and Blackfeet nations rose as one, honoring this decision with their presence and their support. Dr. Vance was crying openly, as were several of the Smithsonian officials. Within moments, the entire courthouse was on its feet, applauding two people who'd just made one of the most selfless decisions any of them had ever witnessed. Clara Bishop, watching from the back of the room, felt shame burn through her, like fire. She thought about every cruel thing she'd said about Martin and Dorothy, every judgment she'd passed, every time she'd called them foolish or crazy. She thought about 6 years of mockery, 6 years of gossip, 6 years of believing she knew better than they did how to live. And now these two people, these supposedly foolish old folks, had just demonstrated more wisdom and grace than she'd shown in her entire 68 years. She left the courthouse before the applause ended, unable to bear looking at them, unable to face what their generosity revealed about her own smallness. She wasn't alone in that shame. All across Ridgewood, people who'd judged the Hayes couple, who'd laughed at them behind their backs, who'd predicted their doom during the blizzard, now had to reckon with what had been revealed. Not just about Martin and Dorothy, but about themselves, about what their judgment said about them, about how wrong they'd been, and how willing they'd been to be cruel to people who were different. Pastor Mackenzie addressed it directly in his Sunday sermon the week after the announcement. The church was packed. More people than had attended in years, all of them knowing they needed to hear this. The pastor stood at the pulpit, looking out at his congregation, and spoke without notes. For 6 years, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, Martin and Dorothy Hayes lived among us. They were our neighbors, our fellow citizens, and for 6 years we judged them. We called them foolish. We said they were crazy. We predicted they'd freeze to death. We mocked them at the diner, at the post office, even here in this church. We treated them with contempt because they lived differently than we thought they should. He paused, gripping the pulpit. And then a storm came, a terrible storm that we all feared. And while we huddled in shelters, questioning whether they'd survive, they not only survived but discovered something that had been hidden for a century, something worth more money than this entire town will generate in a decade. And what did they do with it? They gave it away, all of it. They chose preservation over profit. They chose legacy over luxury. They chose to honor a dead man's dream over enriching themselves. His voice broke. They showed us what real faith looks like, what real wisdom looks like, what real courage looks like. And in doing so, they held up a mirror to our own failures, to our quickness to judge, to our inability to see value in lives lived differently than our own. They didn't do this to shame us. They did it because they understood something we didn't. That some treasures can't be measured in dollars. Some. He looked around at faces streaked with tears, at people nodding, at the collective understanding that something had shifted in Ridgewood's soul. I think we owe them an apology, all of us. But more than that, I think we owe them our gratitude and our changed hearts. Because Martin and Dorothy Hayes just taught us how to be better people if we're willing to learn. The change in Ridgewood wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. People started speaking differently about the Hayes couple, started speaking differently about difference in general. Clara Bishop, to her credit, was one of the first to apologize. She drove out to the property on a quiet Tuesday morning, climbed the spiral staircase with difficulty and determination, and stood on the platform looking at Dorothy through eyes red from crying. I'm so sorry, she said, the words tumbling out. I said terrible things about you and Martin. I judged you without knowing you, without trying to understand. I was cruel, and I was wrong, and I'm so deeply sorry. Dorothy set down the dish she'd been washing, dried her hands, and walked over to Clara. Without hesitation, she pulled the older woman into a hug. We forgive you, she said simply. People fear what they don't understand. You understand now. That's what matters. Clara cried on Dorothy's shoulder for 5 minutes, releasing years of stored bitterness and judgment, feeling the weight of it lift as Dorothy just held her, forgiving without conditions, without demands, with the kind of grace Clara was only beginning to understand. When she finally left, climbing down the staircase carefully, she felt lighter than she had in years. And she became one of the preserve's most vocal supporters, using the same energy she'd once used for gossip, to spread word about the importance of what Martin and Dorothy had done. The legal process of establishing the preserve took 8 months. Negotiations between the federal government, the state, the university, and the tribal nations were complex but ultimately successful. Martin and Dorothy were involved in every major decision, ensuring Samuel's intentions were honored, that the land would be protected in perpetuity, that research and education would be prioritized over tourism or profit. They signed papers that made them official caretakers, gave them lifetime rights to remain in the treehouse, and ensured they'd receive a small stipend for their work, managing the property. Not wealth, but enough to live comfortably. The Samuel Hayes Memorial Nature and Heritage Preserve was officially dedicated on a brilliant October afternoon, the aspen trees golden against the deep blue Montana sky. Over 300 people attended, including their 3 children who'd flown in from across the country, 10 grandchildren ranging from age 5 to 23, representatives from indigenous nations in full ceremonial dress, state officials, university professors, conservationists, and what felt like half of Ridgewood's population. Martin and Dorothy stood beside the dedication plaque, mounted on a stone cairn near the base of the treehouse. The plaque bore Samuel Hayes's name, his dates, and a quote from his final journal entry. "This land is sacred. Guard it with your life." Below that was added, "Protected in perpetuity by Martin and Dorothy Hayes, who finished what Samuel began." The ceremony included speeches, blessings from tribal elders, presentations by Dr. Vance about the research that would be conducted. But the moment people remembered most came at the end, when Martin was asked to say a few words. He stood before the crowd, this man of 74 who'd spent his life working with his hands, who'd never sought attention or acclaim, and spoke from the heart. "My great-grandfather died thinking he'd failed," Martin said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "He thought hiding his work meant giving up, but he was wrong. Sometimes, protecting something means keeping it hidden until the world is ready to value it properly." He just had faith in a future he'd never see. Faith that eventually, someone would come along who'd understand what he was trying to preserve. He looked at Dorothy beside him, reached for her hand. "Dorothy and I, we're just 2 people who wanted to live differently, who wanted to build a home in the trees, and live simply, and be left alone. We never planned to find anything like this. But we did, and when we did, we had a choice. We could have taken the money, could have become rich beyond imagination. Nobody would have blamed us." He paused, looking out at the faces, watching him, his children, his grandchildren, neighbors who'd once mocked him and now looked at him with respect, strangers who'd traveled hundreds of miles to be part of this moment. But wealth isn't just about money. It's about knowing your life meant something. It's about leaving the world a little better than you found it. It's about honoring the people who came before you and protecting things for the people who come after. That's the real treasure we found. Not in the journals or the artifacts or the dollar signs, but in the opportunity to be part of something that matters." The applause that followed wasn't polite ceremony. It was genuine, powerful, sustained. Martin's son, Michael, stood with his arm around his teenage daughter, tears running down his face, understanding his parents in a way he never had before. Jennifer held her youngest child, whispering, "That's your grandma and grandpa. Remember this." Thomas, in his Marine's dress uniform, stood at attention, saluting his parents with the kind of respect he'd once reserved for commanding officers. The preserve opened to limited public access the following spring. Researchers came first, establishing monitoring stations, beginning long-term studies. Then came carefully managed educational tours, small groups led by trained guides, learning about the ecological and historical significance of the land. The cave system remained restricted, accessible only to researchers and indigenous community members for ceremonial purposes. But there was enough to see, enough to learn, that visitors left transformed, understanding in new ways how much history existed beneath their feet, how much life depended on protecting wild places. Ridgewood itself transformed. The preserve brought attention, visitors, resources. The dying town found new purpose. The Silver Fork Diner expanded, adding a bakery that served breakfast to tourists. The general store started carrying books about Montana history and indigenous cultures. A small museum opened on Main Street, partnering with the preserve to share Samuel Hayes's story and display reproductions of his journals and maps. People who'd moved away started moving back, seeing opportunity where they'd once seen only decline. Young people who'd planned to leave after high school started staying, interested in conservation work, in research, in being part of something meaningful. But more than the economic revival, something shifted in the town's character. Ridgewood became known not just as a preserve gateway, but as a place that had learned an important lesson about judgment and humility. The story of how the town had mocked Martin and Dorothy, and how wrong they'd been, became part of the local lore. A cautionary tale parents told their children. A reminder that difference doesn't mean wrong, that unconventional doesn't mean foolish, that sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones carrying the most valuable wisdom. Recognition came from beyond Ridgewood, too. Martin and Dorothy were invited to the state capitol, where the governor presented them with Montana's highest civilian honor for conservation. They were featured in National Geographic, photographed in their treehouse with the forest spreading out behind them. They were interviewed on National Public Radio, their quiet voices carrying across the country, telling their story with characteristic humility. They were offered book deals, movie rights, speaking tours. They declined almost everything, preferring to stay in their treehouse, to live their simple life, to do the work of caring for the preserve. They did accept one honor, though. The University of Montana awarded them honorary doctorates in environmental conservation. They attended the graduation ceremony, both of them in caps and gowns, sitting on stage beside professors and dignitaries, looking slightly uncomfortable, but deeply moved. When they received their diplomas, when the auditorium full of students and families rose in standing ovation, Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes and whispered to Martin, "I wish Samuel could see this." And, quote, "Maybe he can," Martin whispered back. Life settled into a new rhythm. They were still the same people, still living the same simple life. Wake with the sun, feed the wood stove, tend the garden, walk the preserve trails, meet with researchers, answer questions from visitors, read in the evenings, watch the stars through their skylight. But now their purpose was clearer, more defined. They weren't just living in the forest. They were stewarding it. They were teaching by example what it looked like to value preservation over possession, legacy over luxury, purpose over profit. Their children visited more often now, bringing grandchildren who climbed the spiral staircase with wide eyes and wonder, who learned to identify plants Samuel had documented, who listened to stories about great-great-grandfather Samuel, and understood they came from a line of people who did the right thing even when it was hard. Michael brought his daughter Emma, who was studying environmental science, and she spent 2 weeks at the preserve, doing research for her thesis. Jennifer's son Aaron decided to become a park ranger after visiting, inspired by his grandparents' example. Thomas, retired from the Marines, moved to Ridgewood and took a job as preserve security coordinator, wanting to be close to his parents and to protect what they'd protected. Years passed. Martin turned 80, then 81. Dorothy was 79, then 80. Their bodies slowed, their hands shook more. The climb up the spiral staircase took longer. But they stayed in the treehouse, stayed in the life they'd built, stayed true to their purpose. When people suggested they might be more comfortable in town, in a house with all conveniences on one level, they just smiled and said, "We're fine where we are." On a warm evening in late summer, 8 years after they'd found Samuel's hidden collection, Martin and Dorothy sat on their platform, watching another sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. The forest around them hummed with life. Researchers were camped below, their voices carrying up through the branches. A great horned owl called from somewhere nearby, announcing the approaching night. The air smelled of pine and wildflowers, and the good clean scent of wilderness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd taken the money?" Dorothy asked quietly, her hand in Martin's, as always. Martin was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly I'm grateful we didn't. Money would have complicated everything, would have changed us. This way, we got to stay who we are, got to finish what Samuel started, got to show people, especially our grandchildren, that some things matter more than wealth." Dorothy nodded. "I saw Emma yesterday, measuring tree growth rates for her study. She told me this place, this preserve, is why she's pursuing environmental science. She said we taught her that one person's choices can matter, that standing up for what's right is worth more than any amount of money. Then we did good," Martin said simply. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing overhead, as they'd done thousands of times before. The treehouse creaked gently in the evening breeze, the sound as familiar as breathing. Below them, the land Samuel Hayes had tried to protect. The land they'd refused to exploit, spread out in all directions, wild and sacred, and finally, truly safe. "You know what I think?" Dorothy said after a while. "I think people spent 6 years calling us foolish because they measured life by the wrong things. They measured by conventional houses and conventional choices and conventional wisdom. But we measured by happiness, by purpose, by doing what felt right, even when it looked wrong to everyone else. And in the end," Martin said, "we found treasure they couldn't even imagine. Not the artifacts or the journals or the dollar value, but the treasure of knowing we did something that mattered. Of knowing this land will be here for Emma's grandchildren and their grandchildren. Of knowing we were part of something bigger than ourselves." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "We were mocked for staying in a treehouse during a blizzard, and that blizzard revealed what everyone else was too blind to see." Martin finished. They sat together as night fell completely, as the Milky Way blazed overhead in all its glory, visible here in a way it could never be in towns with streetlights and noise. Two people who'd been judged, dismissed, written off, and who'd responded not with bitterness but with grace, who'd been offered unimaginable wealth and chosen principle instead, who'd spent their final years not accumulating but preserving, not taking but protecting, not seeking recognition but quietly doing what they knew was right. The story of Martin and Dorothy Hayes spread far beyond Ridgewood, beyond Montana, becoming something larger than the simple facts of their discovery. It became a parable about judgment and humility, about how the people society mocks are sometimes the ones carrying the most wisdom, about how unconventional lives can have extraordinary purpose, about how a 73-year-old carpenter and his wife, living in a treehouse everyone called foolish, could find and protect a $230 million treasure, and then give it all away, choosing legacy over luxury, principle over profit, preservation over personal gain. And for everyone who heard their story, For everyone who visited the Samuel Hayes Memorial Nature and Heritage Preserve and climbed that spiral staircase to meet the couple who lived in the trees, the lesson was clear. True treasure isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in courage, in integrity, in the willingness to protect what matters, even when everyone says you're crazy. It's measured in the choice to stay true to your values, even when temptation is overwhelming. It's measured in knowing that when your life ends, you'll leave the world better than you found it. Martin and Dorothy Hayes weren't rich by conventional measures, but they were wealthy in ways that matter, in ways that last, in ways that echo through generations. They were two people who'd been forgotten, overlooked, mocked, and judged, who'd survived a historic blizzard and discovered a priceless treasure, and then demonstrated what real treasure actually looks like. A life lived with purpose, a stand taken for what's right, a legacy that will protect sacred land and teach important truths long after they're gone. Anyone can choose preservation over profit if they're brave enough to see beyond the dollar signs. Anyone can leave a legacy that matters if they're willing to prioritize purpose over possession. Anyone can prove the doubters wrong if they stay true to themselves and trust that doing the right thing is its own reward. Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but what you choose to do with it. And sometimes the people everyone calls foolish are the ones teaching wisdom the world desperately needs to learn. As morning light touched the peaks of the Beartooth Mountains and spread across the Samuel Hayes Memorial Nature and Heritage Preserve, as researchers began their daily work, and the forest came alive with birdsong, Martin and Dorothy Hayes stood on their platform high in the trees. They weren't thinking about the $230 million they'd given away. They were thinking about Emma studying old-growth ecology below them, about Aaron planning his ranger career, about a town that had learned to question its judgments, about a dead man's dream finally realized, about a land finally, truly protected, about a life well lived. Because treasure was never about the money. It was about this moment, this place, this choice to guard what's sacred with your life. And that treasure, the only treasure that truly matters, was something no blizzard could destroy, and no amount of wealth could buy. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of courage, unexpected discoveries, and choosing principle over profit are waiting for you. Click to keep exploring with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some treasures are worth more than money can measure.